So that's kind of why I've sort of settled on celebrity estates as sort of my vehicle I like to use here. We tempt you in with the how and the bombastic story, but then the why is usually some like pretty nuts and bolts baseline estate planning conversation that applies to just about everyone.
Welcome to The Endgame by Clear Estate, a discussion series where we get real about estate administration, estate planning, and our efforts at Clear Estate to disrupt old systems with new technology. I'm Davide Pisano, one of the co-founders here at Clear Estate, joined by Sarah Hillier, our head of estate solutions.
Thank you. Hi.
So estate planning is one of those topics everyone agrees is important and then avoids until it's urgent. Everyone avoids it, even celebrities. I mean, we're even celebrities. So we hear about all these cases, and I'm sorry to say, but shit shows. And you're like, okay, like you have all this money, you have all this power, you have all these resources. Couldn't you have planned your estate properly?
Yep.
It's crazy. It's crazy. So more money, more influence, more power, more scrutiny, more drama, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. David Lenok is going to join us. He's the senior editor at Wealth Management and co-host of the podcast Celebrity Estates: Wills of the Rich and Famous. So the point is not it's not gossip today. The point is really fact pattern, correct? Like, can we recognize typical fact patterns? Can we recognize typical things that happen in estates and look at kind of like these drama-filled, super high attention situations, but recognize things that are applicable to all of our lives and all of our planning? It doesn't really matter how much money you have. It doesn't really matter how much scrutiny there is on your estate. It's always the same, correct? Like it's and we've seen this, Sarah, and you've seen this much more than I have. No plan, stale plan, not updated plan, poor decisions being made, and then shit show happens.
Yeah, it's definitely a very obvious pattern emerges for sure. And I think that it doesn't, celebrity stories and celebrity estates can certainly be interesting and have a lot of kind of, anecdotes or even like unique, even fantastical characteristics where things are quite extreme. But the reality is, at the end of the day, it all boils down to the same thing, right? It's always about family relationships, human connection, what people and things mean to people. And that spans across, whether you have a little bit of money, a lot of money, whether you're, an A, B, C list or not a celebrity, right? It really is about whether or not you've put a thoughtful plan in place, whether you've thought of the things that are going to be relevant for your estate, big or small, famous or, ordinary, and whether you've actually, communicated those things to your loved ones. And certainly, generally speaking, the stats usually hover around, 50% of people actually don't have a will in place. And while maybe celebrities are slightly more likely to have a will in place, just because they may have advisors around them encouraging it, or they just have maybe, they've thought about it a little bit more because they have more things that they, need to deal with. But there are tons of stories about celebrities who actually didn't plan their estates or planned their estates improperly. It happens literally all the time.
The failure points of estate planning are the same, whether you're a celebrity or not. And then celebrity examples just tend to hyper focus our minds on those failure points. And I think that's what's really interesting about celebrity estates, not from a morbid kind of like
Hmm. Yeah.
Schadenfreude kind of way, but it's really about using those examples to draw attention to what can fail in everybody's estate planning. And I think that's what's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll also say too, as the drama is more maybe, bigger, more theatrical, like so is the sadness and the like unfortunate circumstances, which I think anyone who learns about these cases feels as well, so it's something that I think can be looked upon with the same sensitivity that we think about for everyday families, because at the end of the day, celebrities are just people too, and unfortunately, they have the same things that trip them up as we do. But Davide, I want to actually throw it back to you because, as maybe our listeners might or might not be aware, you do have some unique experience with celebrities and perhaps their estates in your professional career. As we all know around the office, you're previously a senior VP with Cirque du Soleil. So, what, if any, intersection did you have with celebrity estates in that entertainment industry?
While I was at Cirque, we were dealing with potential partnerships with estates of deceased artists and current partnerships with estates. So while I was at Cirque, we had a show, two big shows. So one, Love in Las Vegas the Beatles show, and so basically there were some living members of the Beatles, but
Mhm.
some that were not. Um, and then there was the Michael Jackson show in Las Vegas as well, dealing with the Michael Jackson estate. And what I thought was very powerful at the time, and fundamentally it's about legacy, correct? Like it's about how
Yeah.
how can you maintain through time, after an artist has passed away, how can you maintain the artistic identity? And I mean, obviously, it's clear that there's a commercial relationship there. So there's royalties, there's revenue sharing, there's whatever. But beyond that, it's surprising to see how much those estates were involved from an artistic standpoint in
Mm.
order for the shows and the visual and the visuals and the artistic expression matched what the estate interpreted as the people managing the estate, like how they interpreted that artistic vision.
Hmm.
And I think that's the first time in my life where I really thought, oh my God, like there's really a legacy beyond death, correct? Like there's
Yeah.
there's people that are carrying around the torch and going, no, like we don't want this because we know the person wouldn't have wanted that,
Hmm.
or we don't want this because or we want more of this because we know they cared about that in art, like in a performance. And so that was amazing. And I feel like I never really thought that an estate could care that much.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I always undervalued, or I guess
Underestimated,
I
maybe.
underestimated, yeah, like the amount of care and
Hmm.
passion that the managers of the estate would put into actually upholding the values and upholding the vision and the artistry of
Hmm.
of of certain people. And what my experience at Cirque kind of like brought forward is, oh my God, like people care, correct? Like people care.
Yeah.
They carry the emotion, they carry the history, they carry the vision. And it was very enlightening. And so,
Yeah.
and these are not small estates, correct? Like the Michael Jackson estate is not a
Yeah,
small
of
estate.
course.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so, and
Not
so,
by
and
any
so,
means.
not by any means, but they cared and
Yeah.
they really were managing the whole portfolio, the IP portfolio, and the way that it was expressed in a way that now Michael Jackson's gone, but in a way that they thought Michael Jackson would have wanted um, it to be portrayed.
Yeah. Yeah. Super, super interesting. And I imagine that that could either happen because there's folks involved that will take it upon themselves to like ensure that that legacy is carried out in a certain way, or it could happen because somebody thoughtfully and intentionally, planned it that way. But it obviously shows because some of these musicians are, their legacy clearly carries on, and the icons that they are clearly carry on and have carried on and continue to carry on. So, somebody is doing something right, probably.
So I think it's a bit of both, correct? Like there's a bit of planning that goes into this, but there's also a little bit of the humility of inheriting the Prince estate, for example,
Hmm.
or the Lennon estate, and going, okay, so I'm not just managing money here. Like I'm managing a true legacy. There's a sense of duty, and you can be completely reckless and irresponsible, but most people are not, correct? And so
Yeah.
most people end up taking on that duty and that responsibility and going, okay, so this is not just about milking the cow, but it's also about making sure in a commercial sense the brand is respected, but
Hmm.
also in a more genuine sense that the artist is respected and that the brand or the image or the voice or the artistry is continues as it would have been intended. So I think it's a bit of both. It's a bit of planning, but it's also I think it's a lot about the people that actually inherit this and go, I'm going to be respectful of what I got.
Yeah, absolutely.
So today, we're digging into some high-profile estate cases that have made headlines worldwide. So David is an amazing guy. He's a lawyer. He thinks through these celebrity estates in a way that extracts kind of like the key points that we need to all learn about estate planning. We're talking about top Hollywood estates. We're talking about big musical estates, and each one of those situations. What I really love about David is the fact that he looks at them and I mean he apologizes for the morbid view that he kind of like the attention that he's putting on this, but he has a great way of extracting two or three key points from each one of those case studies and drawing lessons for everybody's estate planning. I think that's what's really cool about David and about his podcast and our conversation today with him. Let's bring in our guest, David Lenok, to chat about his years documenting celebrity and other high-profile estate cases. Welcome to the Endgame, David.
Thank you, Davide. Thank you, Sarah. Nice to be here.
So before we dive into, I mean, we all want to hear the spicy celeb stories, but we should mention that you're the senior editor of an important publication called Wealth Management. It's published by Informa in the US. Your company also runs publications like Trusts and Estates, which, as a professional journal, dates back to 1904. So clearly, it's been a while that people are interested in these types of topics. This is something fascinating. So, how did you get into? I mean, before we dive into it, how did you get into celebrity estates?
I'm an attorney by trade, so I had actually started working with, it was then Penton Media for anyone who's into the fun media rights sales aspect of things. But with the Trust and Estates magazine, with the legal journal, I was the legal editor for a number of years, and we were a sister publication of what was then called Registered Representative. At some point, one of our publishers had the genius idea, literally written down on a bar napkin, to create the domain wealthmanagement.com, which is now just wealth management. And we gradually moved sort of everything under that banner. After like, I think 4 or 5 years with Trust and Estates, I had sort of adopted this, using celebrity estates as an example to kind of make estate planning topics less scary, to sort of get people in the door, to just like get the conversation rolling. Because I think the thing you'll notice, I'm sure I'm not telling you guys anything new, but it's very hard to start these conversations. But like once you get them started, it's like not that hard to keep them going. That kind of it's sort of a snowball effect where, as long as you get the right push and keep people from being too spooked, they'll kind of do a lot of the legwork on their own once you just push them into motion. So that's sort of where the idea started. And then I've gradually moved to my current position, which is with wealth management, which caters largely to financial advisors and other sort of wealth planning professionals, and not really so much lawyers anymore. And I do a lot of sort of translating of legalese and a lot of just trying to translate estate planning topics for other financial planners who arguably at this point are in a better position to sort of quarterback the process than actual estate planning attorneys are a lot of the time. But obviously people are worried about illegally practicing law, and estate planning itself is sort of like all of the scariest topics, death and money and family all sort of wrapped into one spooky conversation. So people need a little, coercing and a little sort of demonstration that it's not as scary or as complex as it sounds or it might initially look.
You looked at horror stories, you've looked at like best case stories. Starting on a positive note before we go into juicy details. If you were to take the best planned estate, and you can use a celebrity one if you want as a best planned estate, what are the key takeaways there? Like what represents, and what are the 2, 3, or 4 or 5 kind of pillars of a well-planned estate?
So my two main sort of things you look for are flexibility and communication. I have a podcast on my own, and I always joke that every episode, we're called Celebrity Estates, but we could just be called the Communication and Estate Planning Podcast, because that's kind of, no matter what crazy estate we're talking about or sort of how lessons we're learning, it's always just kind of comes down to like, or we could have avoided all of this by just talking to each other. And it's shocking, really, how much of estate planning and how much of estate planning conflicts is based in emotion and not so much as much in sort of hard money as like movies and TV shows would sort of want you to believe. It's a lot more of a psychological affair than it is a dollars and cents one most of the time when you're dealing with conflicts. And a lot of that is just managing expectations. So communication is a huge one. And then flexibility, you're creating a document that is meant to last, in perpetuity, conceivably, if the person somehow never died. But you don't know when they're going to die, and that could be in 10 years or it could be in 70 years, depending on the age of the person. And, I imagine a lot of what we consider, if you just look at movies from 70 years ago, what the future might be like, we were pretty off. So, to try to, to have the hubris to sort of create a document that is going to last that long and without any sort of changes or flexibility is a little ridiculous on its face. So you have to build in that flexibility for to just adapt, and the fact that things are going to change, very likely change a lot before this document actually has to go into effect.
So you're using celebrity estates to get people engaged and thinking about, I'm assuming, their own estate, or at least somebody in their family, their parent or a family member. So I'm assuming that part of the hypothesis behind that is that there's something to be learned there. Question is, are celebrity estates just representations of, or do they just manifest, or are they examples of what everyday people kind of like live through? I mean, I think you used the term with the volume turned up. Is there really something to be learned for all of us in those very public examples of what can go right and what can go wrong?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think, obviously the whole reason, we all love a little schadenfreude, right? Just to sort of enjoy, the misfortune of others and sort of the tabloid aspect of the celebrity estate, because, I mean, it seems so silly and so outlandish that you can just sort of enjoy it, sort of treat them almost as less than human, because it's like, oh, this is such a crazy life they lead. I have no connection to this. And a lot of these stories, that's kind of true. They're super silly, they're super bombastic. No normal person, would ever find themselves in that situation. But, when you sort of strip away, it's like trying to find the allegory in a work of fiction, right? You sort of strip away the crazy stuff that really kind of is apropos of nothing. That's just sort of, a lot of times the crazy stuff is red herring, but like, how you're reading about how they're fighting. Where, I mean, I know, you know, Casey Kasem, famously, his then, wife, made off with his body, and her and the kids were having arguments in the street. They were throwing frozen meat at each other in the street. And it's like, and that's like completely ridiculous, right? It's like, oh, my family will never do that. It's like, but yeah, and your family won't do that. But it's like, but why did this family do that? Like, that's how they fought. And how they fought is extremely silly. But why were they fighting that way? And at the end of the day, it just kind of boils down to stepkids don't like their stepmom. And like, that's a tale as old as time that applies to everyone who has step parents, basically, bar a lucky few. And so it's those kind of lessons where if you can look past, the ridiculousness of the how, the why is usually something like really basic and universal. And so that's what we try to find in these stories where it's like we get, the viewer in, it's a little bit of a bait and switch. We tempt you in with the how and the bombastic story, but then the why is usually some like pretty nuts and bolts baseline estate planning conversation that applies to just about everyone. And so that's kind of why I've sort of settled on celebrity estates as sort of my vehicle I like to use here, because you can so reliably find kernels of normalcy, even in the craziest sort of stories, or even in craziest fictional stories.
I'm listening to you talk, and engineers pressure test systems. So basically, you have a plane or you have whatever, and then you're saying, if we were to take this plane to extreme conditions, would it survive? Same thing with a car, same thing with any system. Do you think that celebrity estates are a form of pressure testing some of these systems, in the sense that if you can inject a lot of wealth, a lot of power, a lot of family drama into a structure that we're all using, essentially, you're essentially pressure testing some of these structures that we put in place?
Yes and no. I think like there's certainly certain situations where, just by injecting more money and normally more publicity, I would say would be the more sort of effective part of that, where you are sort of turning the heat up on people and people's emotions so much that, maybe you're pressure testing a little bit. The point that I found in a lot of these is that like the money and the power and they're kind of like beside the point, which is kind of crazy to say, right? But when you look at what these people are really fighting over, most of the time it's, even if they are, fighting over a position in a company, the reason they want that position is maybe not necessarily, the power of it. It's, because they're using that as a surrogate for measuring how much, daddy or mommy loved me versus how much they love my sibling. And nobody's immune to that. And I think even if you look at sort of, the most ridiculous situations where you think, oh, money, power, a lot of it ends up coming down to just like, daddy loved me more, or you were always mom's favorite, and now we're going to fight. And I don't care about the money or power I get at the end of it. We just got to fight about this because you know, it's unavoidable. So, I think in that regard, certain things are just so universal that the celebrity aspect of it almost doesn't matter.
The way you're describing it, it's like great Greek tragedy, where you have these archetypes of like family dynamics, and then we're just like watching these estates unravel as kind of like examples of human nature portrayed in its best or its worst form, and we're just watching it both for entertainment, but also as a representation of our own nature.
Yeah, I mean, we're all human. We all have the same nature. We don't want to admit it. But none of us are immune from a lot of these emotions, especially, when you factor in that you're dealing with death. So you're dealing with traumatized people a lot of the time. And they're not necessarily going to be making the most logical decision, or they're trying to be so hyper-logical that they become completely illogical, because they're not in their right minds. And so you're dealing with death, you're dealing with money, you're dealing with family. And these things all can combine into sort of a very potent cocktail of emotion that can turn even the most rational um, people into irrational actors. And they may not even know it's going to happen. There's a lot of these conflicts that come up, you know, say that there was, when Robin Williams passed, there was a bit of a fight over his estate. And it ended up not being over the money in the estate. Nobody cared about the money. They were fighting over his bicycle collection. And that's like a perfect example because I'm sure before that happened, none of those kids was looking at that and like coveting his bicycle collection,
Hmm.
right? Like I'm sure that there was no like, I mean, maybe they thought like, oh, that'd be nice to have, but there was no like, I need that. That this is like a thing I'm gonna like. I'm gonna go to the mattresses with my siblings over dad's bike. No, there's almost certainly not. But when the person dies, and all of a sudden you're looking to cling to any last string of them, then that bicycle collection, in a more normal situation, it could be dad's favorite chair or his childhood baseball mitt or these items that, you probably didn't care about so much when they were alive. Like you noticed them, but they weren't like emotionally, at the center of your being. But once they're gone and that's all you have left of them, well, now this is something worth fighting over because now we're fighting over this sort of ephemeral, idealized version of this person in our heads. And so that's what makes estate planning so difficult is that even with all the best drafting, and all the best techniques, how you can't anticipate that, oh, but dad's crappy old chair is really what's going to make everyone fight and going to cost millions of dollars in litigation because we're going to fight over this thing that none of us knew we cared about until the moment he died. And it's like, how are you as a petitioner supposed to anticipate that happening? And the answer is you can't. And that's why you need to have the flexibility to sort of roll with this conflict, which is inevitable and that you could never have done anything about. Just build the plan, flexible enough to deal with it.
It's funny because on this podcast we tend to be pretty technical sometimes, but then we had one of the great lawyers in Canada in estate planning that told us about an example that the family once the mother died, the family fought over the last frozen apple pie that she had actually baked in the freezer. And that was the biggest source of contention was not the money, was not anything else. It was the apple pie, and it was the last one that she had baked. So I guess it's universal.
Yeah, and I mean, you can take that sort of example and apply it to all sorts of things, fighting over who gets control of the business. A lot of times is the same sort of thing. You've got a sibling who was in the business and one that wasn't. And, but now that, dad or mom or whoever built the business is gone, that's all that's left of, what once was their complete family. And now that one who didn't care about the business and wasn't in the business all of a sudden cares a great deal. And meanwhile, you have the one who's been in it their whole life who are like, well, hey, I kind of earned this. And I also obviously care about it too. But who's right and who's wrong, right? Like you can't deny the one's emotions, and you can't. Then the other is right that they've been working in it their whole lives, and they're the obvious, just like a logical person who should be running things because they've been prepared for it. But you're going to tell that other person that their emotions are invalid, or that they're just causing a fight to cause a fight, like that. Everyone's sort of equally correct and equally sort of insensitive to the other.
Yeah, key piece there is communication in advance, obviously, and expectation management, as you said. So let's get into it. I mean, we want to hear what's your craziest story? Like what's your quintessential craziest, longest, most messy, biggest litigation? I mean, you talked about people throwing frozen meat, in the streets, but what's in your mind, kind of like top two or three kind of craziest estates?
So I mean, off the top of my head, I've always really, talking about these. Obviously, this is like a ghoulish. Right at the start, I'm going to talk about crazy estate stories that I enjoy. So, I mean, I just sound like a total schmuck from the beginning. So, let me just address that I'm not an awful person, and this is sort of a bit of ghoulish pleasure we're taking in these things, and you either take this ride with me or you don't. But I am aware of what this comes off like. So, one of my very, I guess, favorite stories is Jim Thorpe. Yeah, Jim Thorpe was arguably the greatest athlete in American history. He was a Native American. He was in Oklahoma, one of the Oklahoma-based tribes. Olympic athlete, professional athlete, basically did everything. Um, and when he died, he was buried on tribal land, but he had recently married a new wife. being a professional athlete wasn't the most lucrative thing back then, so he didn't leave her with much. And she's like, well, what else can I get out of this? And so she kind of sold his body to the highest bidder. And you may not, you kind of be aware of this, but there's a place called Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania in the US. Jim Thorpe has no connection whatsoever to Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. For all I know, he'd never even been there. So she effectively, they said, we will give you X amount of money and we'll build a museum and a statue if you put his body here. They were looking to purchase a tourist trap, basically. We have nothing to hang our city's name on. We'll rename the whole city after him. If we can have his body, you bury him here. Now, this is obviously insane. But she says, all right. And so he'd already been buried. So this is how powerful the spouse's rights to the remains are in the U.S., is that they went onto tribal land to exhume him and take him away. So they overrode Native American tribal sovereignty to move it to this completely unrelated location, which they then named the entire city after him. So that one I've always really been partial to, just because it's like insane and just sort of like, oh, wow, the spousal right to the remains is like ridiculously powerful. Like that's out of control.
That is pretty wild. On this podcast, we talk a lot about the challenges of co-executorship, and I think the Jimmy Buffett estate is a great example of co-executorship gone wrong. If I remember correctly, he appointed his wife and business manager as co-executors, and now they're suing each other. So first of all, can you talk about it? And second, is this a lesson for anybody listening out there in terms of like how to plan their estate?
This is like an interesting case, right? Because they sort of structured the trust to benefit the wife and children. This is the trust that contains his Margaritaville brand, I think is sort of like what's at issue there.
Yeah.
And then the executors are his business manager and his wife, and they're sort of fighting. Basically, I guess the business manager is, the wife thinks he's withholding information, underpaying things, and he's arguing that he's sort of managing the finances as that was sort of deemed to him by Jimmy. And I think there's a couple of lessons right here where you see, first of all, in a lot of these families, and this is sort of a blended family lesson, I guess. I know that a business manager isn't necessarily part of the family, but a lot of times people can get along as long as the decedent in this case is alive, right? They're linked together by that person. I'm sure that this manager and the wife got along great while Jimmy was alive, and that's why he made them co-executors. He trusts them both equally. And they were happy to play nice while he was there. But then, when you have this web of people around a person who don't necessarily have any relation to one another, once you sort of pluck that person out, then what's keeping them from being at each other's throats? Like, what interest really does this wife have in the betterment of this business manager, or does this business manager have in the betterment of Jimmy Buffett's wife or children, at the end of the day? And the answer is none. And that's a little mercenary, but that's just sort of how human nature is, right? The business manager is going to favor himself, and he's going to use this idea of Jimmy and what Jimmy would have wanted, which cannot be proven very conveniently, as a shield. And the same thing as the wife, where she's going to try to protect herself and her children, and she doesn't care, what the business manager gets out of it. This is, as in her eyes, this is her husband's legacy that's left to her, and who cares about this other guy? So it's always interesting with these co-executorships and these sort of, anytime you're sort of trusting even siblings or best friends, people on good terms to sort of coexist in someone's absence, in the connecting person's absence, it's always a sketchy proposition, because that relationship, you don't know what it looks like without you being involved, right? You know what it is now when you're there, but when you're not there, then and who knows? And that sort of can expand into all manner of sort of, that's where a lot of the blended family, I don't like my stepmom, we get along when my dad's alive, but once my dad's gone, I don't care about you anymore. Or maybe you favor all the kids equally while dad's alive, but your biological kids are going to get favored more once dad is gone. And, these sorts of ideas, it's all the same kind of, sure, we know how things are now, but we can't possibly, we can't really tell how things are going to change when someone is dead. So you're creating a situation where you're relying on a relationship as it is now, staying the same and staying copacetic through a trauma, through whatever the upheaval that causes is, and coming out the other side exactly how you want it to. is oftentimes not a great idea and not super realistic.
Yeah, we always talk about like divorce and new family structures that throws a huge wrench in estate planning, and that is a trigger for re-examining whatever the plan was, and however you're thinking things are going to go. And more particularly, I think that asking your surviving spouse, if they are the stepmother, to be the executor in the future is actually like a really tough job. Like, because I mean, even if you want to be fair,
I mean, just being in, regardless of who you are, being executor is a really tough job. And,
very tough job.
I spend a lot of time on my show just talking about how it's not something you just like leave to Uncle Jimmy because he's like the one
Correct.
you trust. It's like, this is a bigger job than that, man. Like, this is,
So I mean, we talked about the fact that we talk about things that are unpleasant. I know you did a whole episode on the Hackman estate.
I think everyone pretty much knows the sad story that happened there. Gene Hackman had some, form of dementia. And his wife was his caretaker. She apparently fell ill with some like rat-borne disease, I guess, that they didn't know. They had rats in the house, and that's what made her sick. And I guess she passed, and his situation, his dementia was so far that he's not able to care for himself, or I guess even recognize that his wife had passed. And so within about a week, he also passed because there was just nobody taking care of him. Um, and that's, it sort of touches on like one of I think a lot of people's greatest fears, but also sort of just in this, at least in this country, the threat of dementia and planning, end of life planning and sort of what that means and how that is part of estate planning, is sort of awareness of how important that is rising and still needs to be higher, I think. But that should be part of any given estate plan. Estate planning isn't just planning for what happens after death. There's also now, as we live longer, there is a lot of times this lengthy sort of end of life period where you're planning both for incapacity, sort of mentally and physically, and also financially, where the old paradigm used to be like, oh, give everything away as fast as you can, get it out of the estate. But now it's like, well, you got to have enough money to live on, and everyone's living longer. So there's a couple of prongs of now that sort of like end of life planning aspect, that are very, very, actually more important now that the estate tax is, in America at least, the exemption is so crazy high, so as to effectively not exist. Whereas once, a lot of that planning was tax based, now it's sort of more focused on, long-term care and ensuring, income streams through, un unexpectedly long life and sort of the fear of like outliving your money. So, even though the Hackman case is sort of like this awful tableau of what could happen where, you sort of have two old people taking care of each other, and that's sort of not a particularly uncommon fact pattern.
Happens a lot.
But there's the idea of like, okay, but if we're true and true planning, well, who's caring for the caretaker? This takes a certain toll on the caretaker, and something random, some sort of bizarre other illness sort of took her in this case. But the caretaking takes its toll as well, and who watches the watchers, and there's that sort of whole question of well, the planning should take that into account as well. It shouldn't just consider like, oh, my kids will take care of me. Oh, my wife will take care of me when I get old. It's like, okay, well, let's make some allowances for how that's going to happen. And here are some funds put aside for the mental health of the person whose lap I'm dropping my entire being into at the end of life. And these are things that sort of sound obvious when you say them out loud, but sort of previously hadn't been as explored in an estate planning context as they likely should have. And so that I think is a big takeaway from the Hackman estate is the importance of this end of life planning aspect of estate planning, and that it's not just planning for death, but there is planning for the lead up to death as well.
Yeah, and one thing we talked about as well in the past on the podcast is it's not just about kind of like the what in terms of taking care of and the money, but it's also the how,
Mhm.
in the sense of like, how do you want to be taken care of? What kind of choices? Some people are fighters in their lives, and they just want to live as long as they can, and they want to hang on to life. And other people will go, well, you know, if I'm not conscious, then the classic unplug me and it's fine. And so documenting how you want to live if you're not capable of making your own decisions is just as important as planning where the money's going to come from and who's going to make the decisions. So there's some real thinking to be done there and communication, to your point originally, to whomever's involved in that kind of like end of life planning on like where's the money going to come from, who's going to take care of me, but also how do I want to be taken care of, and in what circumstances, what conditions, and what decisions will be made for me in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of the primacy of those other documents, right? I think when you talk to a layman about, estate planning, they're like, oh, a will. I think, in the, older days, we've talked to older practitioners a lot of times, a lot of older practitioners that I've spoken to tell me like that they would charge for the will and they would kind of throw in, for a lesser price, the healthcare proxy and, the living will if they were doing that, or, living a revocable trust maybe if they were in California. Um, and nowadays that sort of paradigm has largely shifted where the will is kind of like,
Yeah,
it's like
it's a
it doesn't
template.
do that much. And but these other documents are really important. And so you're really there now they're kind of charging for the healthcare proxy and for the the powers of attorney. And then the will is sort of like, oh yeah, we'll do that too. Because there's sort of the primacy of these documents is kind of shifted in terms of the importance to the end of someone's life.
100%. Um, Sarah, I know you have a particular interest on high net worth estates, so I know you wanted to address some things with David.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and appreciate you turning it over to me while we're moving on to maybe some more positive stories. Um, but I also just want to say
I'm the
too,
ghoul. I'm the ghoul in the
yeah,
relationship.
exactly. Let's add some hopefully success type stories to the podcast. But I also just want to say too that I understand your sort of apprehension on covering some of these topics, David, and I do think that in my almost 20 years of experience, it's definitely an excellent way to kind of bridge people into the topic of estate planning that, feels at first maybe not relatable, at first feels maybe, that there's a voyeur aspect of it. But once the story starts to emerge, like you said, the, celebrity estates may have lots of, fantastical kind of details to them. However, at the end of the day, the human connection part is really universal. And it doesn't matter what the details are. There's always the aspect of, how does it actually impact the family, right? And I think that is what people really relate to. So all of that to say, I don't think you should consider it ghoulish to cover these topics because I think it actually is really important and helpful for folks.
Thank you for saying that, sir. I've received enough phone calls from the families of celebrities at this point who sort of
Hmm.
misunderstand because it's kind of the risk you take when you sort of take a
Yeah.
tabloid approach is that people will treat it like you're a tabloid, and so
Yes.
I've received a number of angry phone calls and emails from people, and generally I can get them on the phone and tell them exactly what we're doing, and they pretty much to a man understand and are then like, oh no, this is better. We just thought it was someone else trying to like profit from
Yes.
our loved one's death, and so that was our reaction. But so like I've
Yeah.
I've dealt with sort of the blowback from it, so I'm notably careful about it. But in my experience, having had the chance to like explain it to people, the
Hmm.
people directly involved, they're generally quite understanding.
Yeah.
Once you're on the phone with them, at least.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, one of the stories that I found definitely interesting, and I mean, it's still certainly early days as far as estate settlements are concerned, but the Armani empire and, Giorgio Armani, who passed away September, he really had been working on a multiple year kind of succession strategy for the business, and I think it's widely considered to be a success story, at least from what we see so far. So just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and tell us some of your kind of key takeaways there.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the few, I'm always happy when I get to do an episode that's not about like estate failure, right? So
Hmm.
the happy episodes are always the best ones. Sadly, they're few and far between because generally, if a plan works, you don't hear about it. This one was high profile enough that luckily we do hear about it, and it's just so well thought out, and every sort of detail was covered and so well laid out beforehand. Like everything is intentional. I think intentionality is sort of the big takeaway from the Armani estate, where it's like I want there to be a sale. Here are the people that I want there to be sales. So there is some dead hand shenanigans, which normally are bad, but they're done in a way that's flexible enough that like here is a list of 10 places I would like that I would consider acceptable buyers, whereas here is it must be sold to this one place. And the putting of trusted, friends in charge instead of family members. In this case, he has, his trusted, chosen family that he was able to turn things over to, and sort of the business appears like it's going to be in great hands because he was able to do that. And also, one of the interesting things that we're seeing more of, and this actually kind of calls back to what could have helped the Jimmy Buffett thing, was this idea of bifurcating the control of the company from what's funding the livelihood of your family and your other heirs. Because a lot here, it's like he's separated into different places. So, the family still profits from the company, but in terms of, what they're getting is not couched in terms of how X percentage of the company. Like there was a separate amount of money set aside for them to get, to make them, whole, to make their lives easier and to show his love for them. And then the company itself and control of the brand and what the brand is about is completely bifurcated in a different area. I think that's an increasingly popular way to do this. And, it's hard, I think, especially for sort of first generation wealth creators who think of these businesses as their children and as part of their family, to make that sort of severance, which is why we haven't seen more of it.
I think it's what Buffett did as well, no?
Did he sever it?
Yeah, I think there's some of the large fortunes in the US are starting to go that way, which is like you're
Yeah.
just separating essentially the company from kind of like the family fortune, and you're saying these are two separate
Yeah, and,
things.
and the brand lives on separate from my family, but the wealth that we created with the brand stays in the family. And I think that's a really elegant way to sidestep a lot of the problems of ending up with, nepo babies and people in positions where they don't necessarily belong, and to sort of, this sort of deal with the push and pull of wanting to best serve this company that you love, but also wanting to best serve this family that you love, and which takes primacy. So I think a lot of what goes on in the Armani estate is very elegant, very intentional, and is sort of a good example. You can break them down. It's scalable advice, right? Where this is something that a much smaller family business could take this advice and could take a similar approach and scale it down a bit and still end up with a proper estate plan. It's not something that only is going to work if you're the steward of $100 billion brand.
I mean, from everything you've seen, and we know part of the folks listening are business owners, and you talked about scale. What's the threshold? Like, how should one be thinking about this in terms of planning for the transition? I know I have a friend whose spouse is involved in a family business. Her father has the business, and the father refuses to talk about succession, refuses to talk about uh, how things are going to be transferred. And it's not because, I mean, in his mind, there's no question, correct? Like in his mind, it's, well, you're going to get the business and you're going to continue. And doesn't want to actually sit down and, okay, fine, but let's think this through and plan what the next 5, 10 years look like if you actually want me to take this over. And so what's the advice there? Like if you're a small business owner, like how should one be thinking about this in terms of, first of all, emotionally, what to address? And second, to your point, like, does the business survive? Is this another child? Is this like how to think about it?
I mean, this is, a very common problem. I think
Yeah.
particularly first generation wealth creators specifically, I mean, people who, in our case, are sort of chasing and have in a lot of ways realized the American dream. But there's more than just sort of this reticence to talk about money. I think there's a connection a lot of times with someone who's poured so much of their life and soul into a business that they kind of, in their way of, in not avoiding talking about it, is because they can't fathom it existing without them. And like their cult of personality and the business is as inextricably a part of them as they are of it. And in their heads, they're just not capable of thinking of what the business would look like with they're not in it, because they're the ones that birthed it. There never has been a business, this business specifically, without them. And so I think that's the first barrier that has to be crossed. And a lot of times, I think that's the hardest barrier, is that, is this something that can survive you, first of all? Sometimes the answer is that if the business owner is just such a force of personality and they're the ones whose essence is what keeps the business, then sometimes like that business just cannot survive the death of the founder, and that should be planned for if you can recognize it. Where it's like, Big Joe or whatever is just so important to Big Joe's furniture that it can't exist in the same form without Big Joe.
And there's a value conversation to be had there
Exactly.
as well.
Whereas, is it better to bring in someone from the outside? Is it better to just sell it? And then, we'll start anew, because we'll just have much more resources than we had when Dad started.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of conversation there, and there's a lot of soul searching. And ultimately, like I know a lot of this is such like soft topics. If people think of estate planning, they think of drafting and, sort of clever tricks of tax. And like, yeah, there's that. But a lot of this is very soft psychological stuff. It's very delicate. And that's what makes it so hard to talk about a lot of the times. So that's the hardest part, is sort of to get the founder themselves to actually conceive if the business can even be a thing without them at all. And if it can't, then that's a different conversation.
Yeah.
Second, you want to have that conversation because does the kid want to be in the business? Because yeah, maybe in the founder's head, I haven't been the best parent. I've spent a lot of time on this business. I have a certain degree of guilt in my heart about that. But my great gift that I've convinced myself that I'm giving to my children to make up
is a business they don't want.
Is this business, to make up for the father I couldn't have been. I'm giving you this, or you know what I mean. And if they don't want this, then what are you giving them other than a burden? And that takes a lot of forms. That there's plenty of very very philanthropic families that sort of have a foundation or a cause that they care about that maybe their kids don't care about as much, even if their kids are still very philanthropic. And so they'll assume that, the kids are going to take over the Cancer Research Foundation, when we're done. And meanwhile, the kids who really want to spend their lives dedicated to philanthropy want to spend it dedicated to...
They want to plant trees in Brazil. Yes.
Yeah. And so you've successfully passed on the value, but they just happen to not care about the exact cause you care about. And so if you don't have the conversation about what we're doing here, then you're just leaving them a burden when you think you're leaving them a gift. So that's the second part, is do the kids even want it?
Yeah.
And that's, I think it gets lost a lot in estate planning. I think, especially as attorneys, our client is the decedent. And we don't necessarily often speak enough to the family and factor in what they want out of this. And that's such an important part of whether the plan is successful or not. But at the end of the day, like in a weird way, like they're not our client necessarily. And that's a weird relationship that I think laymen don't super understand, but it can be a bit thorny, especially in cases of divorce and things like that, who's client. But yeah, so involving the family and honestly, and that can be difficult also to convince a first generation wealth creator to do, because they've done so much on their own without their input. And they're like, I know what's best for my family. I don't need to ask them. It doesn't even have to be like a crazy controlling thing. It can just, they think that they know best.
I want to pick up on something you said, like you talked about like legacy, you talked about philanthropy. Can you give me an example, celebrity estate, where legacy was important to the planner or the deceased and was carried out properly by the estate? So I have a past in live entertainment, and in my past we've dealt with the MJ estate, we dealt with the Prince estate, we dealt with a few other estates where, I mean, notwithstanding whatever you think of the artist, you could see that the estate was doing their best to actually carry through the spirit and the artistic values of the deceased. Another great one is the Lennon estate. So is there for you in your mind kind of like a quintessential kind of archetype of somebody that thought about their legacy and they set it up in the proper way for the legacy to actually carry through? And legacy is not about money, correct?
That's yeah, and I think that's why it makes it a difficult question to answer, right? Because the answer is no and yes. Because legacy, I mean, what is legacy, right? Like that's kind of
But you have to define it for yourself.
and exactly. And so you're defining your own sort of basis for success, and that can look very different for different families. So I mean, I've spoken with Mitzi Perdue. She was Frank Perdue's wife, and also she's a dual heir because her parents owned Radisson hotels. So she's basically did this twice. And so talking about like so that's like obviously a person born into wealth who then came into more wealth and who's like lived their life as an heir. So like their legacy planning literally has family rules that are carved into bronze and given to the children of what's expected of them. And like they, by her accounts, have been very successful in sort of maintaining the family values that way by sort of literally handing down like the Ten Commandments from on high. Does that work for every family? Absolutely not. That's an interesting example. I think it's a wildly impractical one, but it depending on what legacy you're trying to pass on, you know that can be great. For some people, it's just a legacy of living well, and you could just say any celebrity estate where you didn't hear about a fight.
Or frozen meat being thrown at each other.
Yeah, and that's kind of the problem with these kind of questions of examples of successful ones is that you don't
You
hear
don't
about
hear
them.
about them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the successful ones are the ones that there weren't fights and people
Yeah.
are just happy, and then that's it. An extension of the Prince one that I thought was very interesting was that John Michel Basquiat's father
Yes.
really kind of built his son's legacy. It was almost reverse
Correct. Yes.
because a lot of what Basquiat was and his work and the legacy of what he is now was actually sort of
Built
constructed
afterwards.
post reconstructed from nothing from his father, who by luck was an accountant, and so was
Yeah.
actually equipped with the skills to reverse engineer, tax returns and all the things that were necessary to keep, the estate from having to just immediately liquidate all the art and scatter it to the winds. So I think that's a really interesting story where about legacy, where the legacy was actually built almost completely by the heirs and maintained by the heirs, even though the work was created by the decedent. The legacy was created by the heirs. I think that's a really interesting one.
That's a great example, by the way, of just somebody living their life and creating a lot of value, and the estate actually figuring out that, okay, there's a lot of value to be preserved here.
He had never paid taxes. Like
Yeah.
his father had to completely recreate estate and income tax, like reverse engineered from like receipts and stuff that he'd bought. And like it was crazy, like what he did. And so like I'm like looking at him like this guy's a superhero. This guy's like the greatest accountant of all time.
Superhero accountant.
I mean, like we should, like again, Basquiat's a great artist, but we should write books about his dad. This guy is amazing.
His dad's the hero. I want to conclude on a note. What's your favorite TV show about estates? And I mean, don't say Succession, but like
I mean,
just like
I
something else.
I didn't love Succession. I mean, Succession's a good like for getting articles out of, but I didn't particularly enjoy watching that show. There was a show. I mean, I think Game of Thrones is sort of like
Yeah,
the
Game of
best
Thrones
answer to
is the
that, just because it
ultimate.
goes in so many directions. I'm really partial to. There was a show called Empire that was on Fox,
Yes.
probably about 10 years ago, and it's basically just like hip hop King Lear, and it's like wonderful in its way, just because it like so. I think like just the hip hop trappings of it disarm
Yeah.
people to an extent that they think they're watching one thing when they're actually watching something completely different. And so I thought that was one that I really enjoyed. Also, Taraji P. Henson is just a lot of fun in that show, so I recommend that
Yes.
one.
And movies? Your favorite?
I mean, Knives Out is the first Knives Out movie. That's like a really big one. That's the best one I've seen, in terms of out estate planning. a lot of movies are just sneakily about estate planning. Like
Yes.
there's a lot of estate planning lessons in The Godfather. Like once you start looking for them,
I mean, The Godfather is an estate planning and estate
movie, right?
administration trilogy.
So once you start looking for them, you kind of find them everywhere.
Yeah.
And then, so like I've gotten to the point where I can sort of jujitsu any movie into being about estate planning. If I really try hard enough, I can kind of make it happen. But you don't have to with a lot of stories. And once you start looking for the themes and like okay, what's the relationship with these children? Who's the overlooked child? Who's the most, like you'll see it everywhere. But yeah, Knives Out, the first Knives Out movie, I think was a really good, like overtly estate planning focused
Overtly,
movie
yes.
in the last few years. Yeah.
David, thanks so much. It's been a blast. I think we're going to do another one of these like in 12 months where there's more celebrity estates coming out, and
That's it.
I mean we're getting to a point where the baby boomer cohort is passing away, so there's going to be more estates being created, and in that world more meat throwing in the streets and things like that. But we'll definitely have another conversation. It's been really, really great to have you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Davide. Thanks so much, Sarah. This is really fun.
Sarah, that was it was interesting.
Yeah, super interesting for sure.
I mean, it's crazy how much we can learn from celebrity estates. But I really thought the Armani estate was, and you brought this up obviously, but because you're all things estates, but a well thought through plan,
Yeah.
something that could have been a complete shit show,
Yeah, absolutely.
is going very, very, very well for all intents and purposes. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely a super interesting example of, I mean, we talk about legacy a lot, right? And what does legacy mean? And I think it means different things for different people. But to kind of put it simply, it's really just like the lasting impression that you leave, right? And that could be tied to your assets. It could be tied to, your family. It could be tied to the brand that you've built. And I think this is a super interesting case where a lot was done and thought about in terms of how, they wanted the legacy to continue. And also, it's a super fascinating case of where like there's no sort of direct obvious beneficiaries of the estate, right? Like there's no children, and a lot of times when we talk estate planning, we talk about leaving assets and the legacy we leave to our children, and that's not necessarily true for all families, and this is a great example where there was careful thought that took place over years to create basically a plan and the proper systems and the proper oversight. Now, like I said, we're still somewhat early days as far as, estate settlement goes, but it looks like that there's a solid plan to, continue the Armani legacy for decades to come.
Yeah, because it's not just a brand, correct? Like
Yeah.
I mean, there's basically 3, 4, 5 major Italian designer brands that signal to the world luxury, quality, and so many other things.
Hmm.
So it's not like you're just managing a brand. You're managing. There's a business, there's a brand, there's a vision,
Yeah.
it's very powerful. I'm very impressed about how that was managed. There's another thing that David really emphasized, which we've talked about on a lot of episodes here. It's communication. Like it's upfront communication. And I know you've talked about it. It's interesting that even in celebrity estate context, poor communication versus good communication makes a hell of a difference.
Yeah, Yes, absolutely. And I think that one thing I'll say too, that we talked, I think, a little bit before about, celebrities like are not immune to the same things that, happen to ordinary people. And we talked earlier about you're working with Michael Jackson's estate. And I do recall that, when Michael Jackson passed away, there was a period in time where people thought that there was actually no will in place. And we actually, tell people this all the time when we're doing their planning with them, that if people can't find your will, then it's as if your will doesn't exist, right? Like if you pass away, if you've done a whole bunch of careful planning, but nobody knows that you did that, and perhaps more importantly, nobody knows that, where to look for the physical document, if it is a physical document, it's like you've wasted, the effort of doing the planning, and there's a risk that, things won't go as intended. Almost certainly they won't go as intended. So I thought that's, a super interesting reminder that, even celebrities, have these kind of mistakes occur where, it's like something that you wouldn't think. Like, you'd think that the more assets you have, the more, the bigger your brand, the bigger your kind of legacy, that just wouldn't happen. But the reality is it happens all the time.
And this is where the conversation is painful, but it needs to happen. We know, like, this is not just about the piece of document, the will that goes, okay, 50% here, 30% there, and maybe there's a testamentary trust and whatever. I think everyone has a legacy. Everyone needs to think about what is it that they want the next generation to carry forward. And the document is just about assets and liabilities. But I think there's a conversation that needs to happen beforehand that goes, this is what the celebrity estates and my own experience at Cirque taught me, is people want to do the right thing. Like, people want to do the right thing and they want to carry forward. People care. And if you talk to your kids and go, these are the things that are important to me, it's really hard to bind somebody to say, okay, like, I'm going to leave you $10,000, but I want that $10,000 to go to X and Y charity, versus having the conversation beforehand and going, I'll get you $10,000 for charity, but this is what I'm trying to achieve. Like, this is what I'm really trying to do. And I think 99% of the time, people want to carry forward that legacy. They care about the deceased, and they care about what they want it to happen. So I think that conversation that we've talked about many times, but that conversation is really important. And it's important for the deceased. And it's important also for the people inheriting, because those people, they want to feel good about what they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And I think that to an extent, it's an honor to, carry out someone's legacy. I think that that's how most people look at it. And the more that you know and understand what that person would have wanted through actual, concrete plans and conversations, the more confident that your loved ones can feel that they're actually, fulfilling that legacy for you and for them. So yes, super important for everybody.
So this was an awesome episode. We should have David again on the podcast in 12, 18 months, not morbidly waiting for more celebrity estates,
Yes.
but we'll get some more stories there and lessons learned, correct? Because that's the reason why we're tracking those. They're just kind of like real life cases where people can see what can go right and what can go wrong. We need David. We need those kind of like public stories where people can recognize these patterns and get lessons from them. Don't forget to share and subscribe to The Endgame by Clear Estate on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for joining us. Take care.
ThinkBait. TNKR Media. Good talk.